Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire by Quinn Foster, Ryan Bailey, Keith Keenan, Garrett Birch, and Tyler Mooney. The site of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was the Ash Building, which was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris and was located in the heart of Manhattan at 2329 Washington Place, New York City. Pictured to the right is the building site plan. Fireproof loft building at 12 stories and less than 150 feet. No sprinklers or fire breaks installed. 2 stairways that led to the street. One on Green Street, which had roof access, and one on Washington Place. Narrow, poorly constructed fire escape that led to a courtyard below. All exit doors opened inward. Hydrant and FDC located on Washington Place. Shown here is a diagram of the 9th floor of the building. The fire occurred on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building, and the 9th suffered the highest death toll. All of these hazards contributed to this, including the fact that the 9th floor was never notified about the fire that had begun on the 8th floor. The building, constructed in 1901 in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan, known as the Ash Building. Classified as a fireproof loft building less than 150 feet in height. The Ash Building was 130 feet high with 12 stories, 10,000 square feet per floor. The building was constructed of brick with metal or stone exterior walls, wooden floors and trim, stairways of metal or stone, and elevators. The building employed 500 immigrant workers who were mostly young women between the age of 14 and 23. Then versus now. The 1901 building still stands today and is known as the Brown Building. It is part of and owned by New York University.
History of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which occurred on March 25, 1911 in New York City. The fire was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan and was one of the deadliest industrial fires in U.S. history, which resulted in 146 deaths. The fire occurred at 4:40 p.m. at the end of the workday in a scrap bin under one of the cutter's tables. The first alarm was sent at 4:45 p.m. from a passerby on the street. This slide talks about how many people warned others about the fire, and people even tried to attempt to put out the fire, but because there was no official alarm or firefighting equipment, many people died. This picture depicts rubble left over from the fire. There was long work tables and back-to-back chairs in the building, which became deadly obstacles for workers trying to escape. This slide talks more about how the whole building was essentially a fire death trap. The doors were locked so people could not escape. Some lives were saved by using the elevator until the elevator stopped working due to the heat of the fire. This slide depicts the floor plan of the 9th floor. This picture demonstrates how crowded working conditions were and how difficult escape would have been.
Minutes, the Green Street stairway became unusable in both directions. Terrified employees crowded onto the single exterior fire escape, which city officials had allowed Ash to erect instead of the required third staircase. It was a flimsy and poorly anchored iron structure, which may have been broken before the fire. It soon twisted and collapsed from the heat and overload, spilling about 20 victims nearly 100 feet to their deaths on the concrete pavement below. The following pictures illustrate the ineptitude of the narrow, poorly designed fire escape. Rather than wait and be burned, many of the victims chose to leap from the building to their deaths, 62 in total. The remainder waited until smoke and fire overcame them. The 10th floor of the factory was where executive offices were held. Out of 70 workers, all but 2 survived, including the owners, who evacuated up the Green Street stairs to the roof. FDNY Engine 72 responded at 4:46:30, 1.5 minutes after the alarm was pulled, followed by Engine 33 and a battalion chief. They arrived at Washington Place and connected to a hydrant and the building's standpipe. A 4-man team entered the building with high-rise packs. They connected to standpipes on the 7th floor and began attack on the fire at the 8th floor. Battalion chief ordered a stream aimed at the cornice to try to create a water current for relief to people in the windows preparing to jump. FDNY Engine 18 arrived 3 minutes later. They arrived on the Green Street side, connected to a hydrant and the building standpipe, and prepared for the second interior attack. They stopped the attack to set up life nets after victims began jumping to their deaths. This proved useless as the nets could only withstand the force of one person from 6 stories. They gave up on life nets and continued the interior attack. By the time the fire was under control, in under a half hour, 4 alarms had been transmitted that brought 35 rigs to the fire. 146 of the 500 employees had died, 123 women and 23 men.
Fireproof building. Immediately after the fire, Triangle owners Blank and Harris declared in interviews that their building was fireproof, and that it had just been approved by the Department of Buildings. The fireproof loft building is less than 150 feet in height, that is about 12 stories or under. The ash building was 135 feet high. At 150 feet, or with one additional story, it would have had, as required by law, metal trim, metal window frames, and stone or concrete floors. At 135 feet, its wooden trim, wooden window frames, and wooden floors were legal. While the fireproof building itself will not burn, the merchandise, wood partitions, and other flammable material burn as readily in a fireproof building as in any other. It is like placing paper in a fireproof box. It confines the fire to that locality, but the fire is just as hot and just as destructive within its bounds. As seen here, the fireproof building itself remains intact, while all of the interior furnishings were burned. The stairwell. The law required only a single staircase in a building in which the floor space was less than 2,500 square feet. If the single floor measured more than that, but less than 5,000 square feet, the building was required to have 2 staircases. There would be an additional stairway for each additional 5,000 square feet. By this measure, the ash building with an interior area of 10,000 square feet per floor should have had 3 staircases. This flaw was noted by Rudolph P. Miller, then an inspector of the building department over which he had risen to be director by 1911. On May 7, 1900, he wrote to architect Frank that an additional continuous line of stairway should be provided. The architect asked for an exception because the staircases are remote from each other, and as there is a fire escape in the court, it practically makes 3 staircases, which in my opinion is sufficient. The Green Street stairwell exit, where at the end of the workday employees would be searched for stolen goods. During the fire, workers tried to escape through doors that pulled inward, causing a mob of fleeing and frightened workers. The narrow spiral staircase caused people to lose footing and fall on top of each other.
Blank and Harris already had a suspicious history of factory fires. The Triangle Factory was twice scorched in 1902, while their Diamond Waste Company factory burned twice in 1907 and in 1910. It seemed that Blank and Harris deliberately torched their workplaces before business hours in order to collect on the large fire insurance policies they purchased, a not uncommon practice in the early 20th century. While this was not the cause of the 1911 fire, it contributed to the tragedy as Blank and Harris refused to install sprinkler systems and take other safety measures in case they needed to burn down their shops again. The call for bringing those responsible to justice and reports that the doors of the factory were locked at the time of the fire prompted the district attorney's office to seek an indictment against the owners. On April 11th, a grand jury indicted Harris and Blank on 7 accounts, charging them with manslaughter in the 2nd degree under Section 8 of the Labor Code, which mandated that doors should not be locked during working hours. While no direct legal changes were made to fire codes until years later, the tragedy brought to the public's attention the need for better worker safety programs. Examples being better fire escapes, doorways that swung outwards, and fire suppression systems. New York amended its constitution in 1914 to support workers' compensation law. That law was upheld in 1917 by the U.S. Supreme Court. The tragedy was one of the pivotal moments that eventually led to the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. 3 months after the fire, the New York governor created the Factory Investigating Commission. The fire at Triangle Waste Company on March 25, 1911, is widely considered a pivotal moment in history leading to the transformation of the Labor Code of New York State and to the adoption of fire safety measures that served as a model for the whole country. It painfully illustrated both the unsafe and unjust labor practices while showing that fire inspections and precautions were woefully inaccurate.